There's a common perception that season 1975-76 was an unmitigated disaster for Celtic, as Sean Fallon took charge in the absence of the stricken Jock Stein, and Rangers won the first of two trebles in the latter part of a decade that had begun with Celtic in a position of utter dominance. This impression can also be influenced by Celtic's disastrous Scottish Cup exit at the first hurdle at Fir Park in January 1976 after blowing a 2-goal lead at half-time. Danny McGrain, in his autobiography In Sunshine or in Shadow, certainly remembers it as a time when caretaker boss Sean Fallon was let down badly by some of the senior players at the club. He remembers, when he was suddenly catapulted from being the assistant manager to being the man in charge at Celtic, Sean did not get the moral support and practical backing of the players he was entitled to expect, and that went for the senior professionals, who should have known better. Celtic were Sean Fallon's life, which was more than could have been said for some of the people who let him down. Not unnaturally, though, he found it difficult to be shoved up to the front after 10 years as the man behind Jock Stein. Sean may not have been the greatest tactician who ever lived, but Jock Stein would have been a hard act for anyone to follow, and the lack of respect shown him in his hour of need did not help matters. Among the crop he inherited while the manager was in hospital, though, were enough passengers to fill a jumbo jet. Certainly, there were enough to make sure we never got off the ground that season. McGrain does not name any of the players he was referring to, but as he cast his mind back to that season 12 years later, the memories clearly still rankled. Despite this, it could all easily have turned out so differently for the luckless Fallon. On the morning of the 10th of April 1976, as Celtic travelled to face Dundee United at Tannadice, they were improbably a point ahead of Rangers at the top of the league, a position they had held since before Christmas, with only 7 matches left to play. If the caretaker manager was let down by senior players, it was in that month of April, when Celtic won only 1 match out of 6, drawing 2 and losing 3. By the time they drew 0-0 with Rangers in their 4th league meeting of the season on the 26th of April 1976, the Ibrox club arrived at Celtic Park, having already clinched the championship for a 2nd season in succession. It had unavoidably been a season of transition for Celtic, having parted company with Billy McNeill, Jim Brogan and Jimmy Johnston in the summer of 1975, leaving Bobby Lennox as the last remaining Lisbon Lion. They suffered the huge loss to injury of Steve Murray at the beginning of the new season, and youngsters like Tommy Burns and Roy Aitken began establishing themselves as first-team regulars. But the most significant changes of all were set in motion at the end of the season with the return to the front line of Jock Stein in May 1976. And by the time the new season was taking shape in October 1976, there was a new air of optimism around the club as a goodbye was bid to some older faces, and the manager set in motion the process of building what it was hoped might become his 3rd great Celtic team. Picking up the pieces after Jock Stein's horrific car crash in July 1975, Sean Fallon's first pieces of transfer business were to sign on-loan keeper Peter Latchford on a permanent deal and finalise the capture of Icelandic international Johannes Edvaldsson, which had already been set in motion by Stein. Arriving in Glasgow from an amateur Danish club, Edvaldsson was handed a trial period and joined the squad for a pre-season tour of Ireland. Ken Gallagher reported in the Daily Record of the 19th of July 1975, Icelandic international Johannes Edvaldsson flew into Glasgow last night to train with Celtic. Edvaldsson, 23, has been playing for a 2nd Division Danish team, but has starred for his national side against East Germany, France and Russia. He will train with Celtic today and join them on their 3-game tour of Ireland, where the Parkhead club play Dundalk, Finn Harp and Sligo Rovers. Assistant manager Sean Fallon said, "The player is an amateur and is available to us. We will get a chance to see him in action during the Irish tour. We've had reports on his international displays and he has been a standout. He plays at centre-half and at centre-forward." Celtic boss Jock Stein made the initial moves for Edvaldsson nearly 6 weeks ago. Now the player will get a chance to show what he can do. The new arrival made an immediate impact, scoring on his debut in a 6-1 win over Dundalk on the 24th of July, earning rave reviews from Hugh Taylor in the Daily Record of the 25th of July 1975. Celtic have found a new Billy McNeill. That's the heartening news from Erie as Celtic stormed to a fine victory at their first tune-up game on their Irish tour. The huge success was Icelandic international Jóhannes Edvaldsson. Not only does this powerful defender look like McNeill, but he commands and plays with tremendous confidence. He also scored a goal that was straight out of the McNeill copybook. He came up for a corner, timed his leap brilliantly, and headed in a spectacular effort. The second match of the tour ended in an ignominious 0-0 draw against a Finn Harps team that fielded guest players in the form of West Brom's Mick Martin, who would become Liam Brady's assistant manager at Celtic in 1991, his West Brom teammate Paddy Mulligan, and former Rangers player Alex Willoughby. Edvaldsson was described by the Daily Record of the 28th of July as having played a fair part, and he flew out to join up with the Iceland team for a 2-0 defeat to the Soviet Union on the 30th of July, returning to Glasgow for the pre-season friendly against Derby County on the 2nd of August. Playing against the reigning English champions, Edvaldsson again impressed after a quiet start in midfield, but moving back to central defence after Roddy MacDonald was injured. The Icelander scored the only goal of the game to give Celtic a morale-boosting win that had Doug Bailey in the Sunday Post of the 3rd of August 1975 waxing lyrical about his performance. My old auntie used to say, if you break a cup of the best china, replace it with an identical one and the tea set won't be any the worse. Celtic are obviously thinking along the same lines. The lad they want to fill Billy McNeill's boots is Jóhannes Edvaldsson, as like Big Billy as two peas. To be honest, he's not quite. He looks a bit broader in the beam, but he's none the worse for that. He's got a braw pair of legs to carry him around the park. In this match, he worked on the left of midfield in the first half and centre half second half, after MacDonald limped off. He started off slow and cumbersome, eventually got to grips with the hectic pace, and long before the end had the punters on the terracing attempting to sing his praises. No mean feat with a tongue-fankler of a name like that. Jóhannes showed all-round skill a biggin like him has no right to have. Aye, the bloke from Iceland, who shows about as much emotion as an iceberg, will do me. And so will this Celtic side, who've recaptured their get-up-and-go of a couple of seasons ago. No Celtic signing ever progresses smoothly, and it would be another 5 days before Edvaldsson, already christened Shuggy by the fans, put pen to paper as his terms were settled. By then, though, Celtic were grappling with the problem of Kenny Dalglish's sudden transfer request. Ken Gallagher reported in the Daily Record of the 6th of August 1975. Celtic superstar Kenny Dalglish last night asked for a transfer, and that move will start a transfer chase which could shatter the present British record of £350,000. Meanwhile, the Scottish star is still locked in talks with his club about a new contract. Dalglish asked for the move yesterday after refusing fresh terms. He has followed up that verbal request with a letter which outlines his grievances over the terms offered to him. Late last night, Dalglish told me, "It is true that I have asked for a transfer, but really, I don't want to leave Celtic. I love the club and I love the fans who have been tremendous to me. I feel that I have been forced into this. If things don't work out, then I'm afraid I'll have to leave. That's the way it is. I don't want to, but I have no alternative after the signing talks I have had." The argument Dalglish has with the Celtic board is over the terms of a new contract. He is now operating in the option period designed for discussion. Dalglish, 24, has been capped 20 times by Scotland and played throughout the World Cup campaign. He is the Scottish player most wanted by the big money clubs in England. Arsenal have already been linked with him and, inevitably, Manchester United are being mentioned as possible buyers. If Dalglish insists that he wants to follow ex-Celts Lou Macari and Dave Hay south, then these are two clubs who could want him. My belief is that Dalglish's future lies with Celtic. Clubs with money will want him. So do the Parkhead Club. Most big spenders are finding that good players cannot be bought easily. While the Celtic board had never allowed themselves to be held to ransom by players, allowing Lou Macari and Davy Hay to leave in the past 2 years rather than break the wage structure, there was a feeling this time it would have to be different. The situation was complicated by a new wage policy being implemented by the government to control runaway inflation in the mid-1970s, which banned wage increases for anyone earning over £8,500 a year, and restricted wage increases for those earning under that to £6 a week in the public sector, with calls for the private sector to comply. Plenty of clubs in England could afford to pay Kenny a lot more than Celtic were willing to, but politically it was probably the wrong time for a big money move. Still, Kenny was determined he would leave if a wage rise was not forthcoming. The issue was still hanging over the club as they went into the first competitive match of the season, a League Cup sectional match against Aberdeen at Celtic Park on the 9th of August 1975, and Dalglish turned in a masterclass in a 1-0 win. Dalglish turns on the magic was the headline in the following day's Sunday Post. Doug Bailey writing, "I don't know what kind of cash Kenny Dalglish is looking for before he signs a new contract. I couldn't care less. That's a private matter between the player and club. But whatever the sum, he's worth every penny, and I bet every Celtic fan would gladly weigh in with £1 a head for the Kenny Must Stay Fund." Ian Archer, writing in the Glasgow Herald of the 11th of August 1975, agreed, alluding to the government's pay policy, which he insisted should not apply to footballers. There seems little need for Mr. Healy's restrictions to apply in this case. The footballer, with his short career span, is a special case, and the restrictive terms of employment in this trade, with clubs able to hold players indefinitely, even against their wills, means that there should be no moral outrage. That, hopefully, can be arranged, for it is doubtful if the fans would react as tolerantly, in the case of Dalglish, as they did when Davy Hay and Lou Macari were taken from them. Nor can Scottish football generally afford to see its major spectator attraction granted a transfer and transported to the battlefields of the English game. A cleverly taken goal by Dalglish 11 minutes in was the difference between the teams, and Archer was in no doubt that Celtic would be greatly diminished if Dalglish was sold, writing they would be all gin and no tonic. Whether the board were willing to meet Dalglish's demands seemed a moot point, as John Rafferty pointed out in the Scotsman of the 12th of August 1975. "As everybody should know by now, employees are restricted to a rise of £6 when their contract is due for renewal, but the point which applies to Dalglish is that increases are forbidden for those who earned over £8,500 during the past year. One does not have to be clever or even inquisitive to know that Dalglish earned more than that sum. The last Celtic balance sheet disclosed that one employee of the company earned over £12,500 and that 9 earned between £10,000 and £12,500. There is just no way that Kenny Dalglish could not be among that 9, so he is well above the figure at which increases in salary are forbidden. The point which might impress the Celtic Board of Directors is that it is they who will be dealt with if there is a contravention of the law. One would imagine that there might have been some room for manoeuvre had the negotiations been carried on in secrecy, but as soon as they became public, there was little that the Celtic directors could do. Dalglish was still insisting he did not want to leave Celtic, responding to Rafferty's question if that's what he wanted. "Don't be silly, John. You know how I feel about Celtic. You know I don't want to leave. Everything I have is bound up here." Rafferty heavily hinted that Dalglish's issue was the same as Davy Hay's had been. Too much of his wages being dependent on win bonuses, and, in Dalglish's case, a fear that in the current circumstances, win bonuses might become scarcer for Celtic players in the immediate future. Dalglish, it seemed, like Hay, wanted a higher guaranteed salary. To the great relief of the support, agreement was reached between club and player, and he signed a new 2-year contract on the 19th of August 1975 and was quoted by Ken Gallagher in the following day's Daily Record. Things are now settled. I had a problem about conditions, but that has all been cleared up in the talks with the club. I can't say how happy I am. I said all along that I didn't want to leave Celtic, and I meant it. They are the greatest club in the world. The Celtic fans have always been good to me. They were even better during this trouble. Their encouragement helped me on the field and convinced me that I didn't want to play anywhere else. Having re-signed, Dalglish was also named the new club captain after Bobby Lennox had filled in since Billy McNeil's departure, and celebrated with another brilliant performance against Hearts in the League Cup at Celtic Park that evening. A 3-1 win avenged an earlier 2-0 defeat at Tynecastle, and Celtic went on to top the section, following this up with an 8-0 defeat of Dumbarton at Boghead and a 2-0 win at Pittodrie on the 27th of August, when Andy Ritchie came on as a late substitute and scored a brilliant solo goal to clinch the win. The first league match of the season, and the first ever match of the new Premier Division, was at Ibrox on the 30th of August 1975, and it might be seen as Celtic's season in microcosm. They were by far the better team in the first half, but had only a Kenny Dalglish goal to show for their efforts as they led 1-0 at half-time, with trouble breaking out on the terraces. Jim Blair wrote in that day's edition of the Evening Times, "Kids spilled onto the track behind Latchford's goal, but temporary barriers and quick police action stopped them from going any further. Can-throwing fans were arrested by police, and they were still sorting things out when Celtic opened the scoring in 42 minutes. Lennox put Dalglish clear on the right, and Celtic's captain Marvel ran from the centre line before shooting past McCloy, the ball being deflected past the Rangers keeper by Tam Forsyth. Celtic deserved their lead. They kept up the pressure, and twice Greg had to rob Lennox to prevent further goals. Despite some light-hearted half-time entertainment provided by an It's a Knockout style competition compared by Glenn Daly, more trouble broke out in the Rangers' end at half-time. Having played themselves into a winning position, Celtic threw away the lead inside 15 minutes at the start of the second half, and even after Alex MacDonald was sent off for kicking Danny McGrain, failed to convert any of several good chances. John Rafferty wrote ominously in The Scotsman of the 1st of September 1975, "There were too many ordinary players on the field, and not enough by far good ones. The Celtic standard has slipped alarmingly. There is a depressing sameness about a lot of them, and a lack of sharpness and positiveness in finishing. They had more chances than they needed to win any game, and scored but one goal, and that a deflection. They seemed to have the football to win, and early showed how to open Rangers' defence. They drew Rangers defenders forward, and then threw the ball beyond them for Lennox or Dalglish to sprint onto. And then later, they forgot about that, and played a game which was active, but without subtlety. There would have to be a spectacular raising of the quality of the side if the Premier Championship is to be won." A week later, at Celtic Park, Jock Stein made his first visit to the ground since his car crash, to see Bobby Lennox score the first Celtic hat-trick in the Premier Division, to set them on the way to a 4-0 win over Dundee, a young Jackie McNamara senior scoring the fourth. Stein was given a huge ovation when he arrived unheralded in the stand, and the news quickly spread around the ground.
Superbly there, timed that well. Wilson, Lennox. It's a goal. 24 minutes in the second half. Bobby Lennox makes it 2-0 for Celtic, and that could be the clincher. Not a good cross, stopped by Connelly. Dalglish, a lovely header to McNamara. Glavin shouting for it and getting it. Lennox lying wide and onside at the moment. Wilson, McNamara, Glavin all racing to the centre. Inevitably McGrain coming up. Lennox through to Glavin. Lovely move. Driven in and it's a goal. Lennox scores. Lovely move, and that's Bobby Lennox's hat-trick. 32 minutes gone in the second half. Callaghan to Dalglish. Callaghan clear on the left. Lovely ball from Dalglish. Wilson and Lennox on the far side. Chance for a goal, and it's there. McNamara has scored.
Pat McCluskey was in the centre of defence, although he was eventually replaced by George Connelly, making his second substitute appearance of the season. But events had been set in motion earlier in the week that might go some way to explain the gradual decline of his career over the next 2 years. Scotland had defeated Denmark 1-0 in Copenhagen in a European Championships qualifier in midweek, and Pat McCluskey was part of the under-23 squad who had beaten their Danish counterparts the night before. On the morning of the Dundee match, the story broke that he had been involved in the now infamous incident in Copenhagen in the early hours of Thursday the 4th of September, where, in the company of Billy Bremner, Willie Young, Arthur Graham and Joe Harper, he had been thrown out of a nightclub after the police had been called to deal with a disturbance over the drink spill, and there was a further incident at the team hotel when they returned long after the 1 a.m. curfew manager Willie Ormond had set on the players. Supporting the idea that the drink spill had sparked trouble, Ian Archer reported in the Glasgow Herald of the 8th of September 1975, "A Danish paper has reported that Billy Bremner, Joe Harper, Pat McCluskey, Willie Young and Arthur Graham entered a place called the Bonaparte nightclub in the early hours. If true, it was a very silly move, for entry into a Danish nightclub is the fastest route from solvency to bankruptcy known in the Western world." The newspaper also reported that a lamp was broken, that some of the players were very drunk. At 4 in the morning the police arrived and, so the story goes, they were invited to leave. There is an even better tale being told, although it has to be said that Bremner strenuously denies it. There is a rumour flying about that a member of the SFA party, back in the team's hotel, was annoyed at finding his room somewhat disturbed, and that his remonstrations with Scotland's captain consisted in not so much polite debate, but active intervention, which, had the action totally succeeded, would have put Bremner out of Saturday's match against Wolverhampton Wanderers. Bremner's Leeds teammate Peter Lorimer, speaking in 2011, told Bremner's biographer Richard Sutcliffe for Bremner, the real King Billy, of how he had warned the captain to steer clear of the young lads from Aberdeen, who had a bit of a reputation. Bremner had promptly made a beeline for them, and Lorimer related, within 20 minutes they were going to fight everyone. But that was Billy. He had to be in the middle of things. He couldn't just sit with the older lads talking football and eyeing the birds up. He wanted to be where things were going on. On Bremner's return to the team hotel, Lorimer remembered, "I was rooming with Billy in Copenhagen and knew something serious must have happened. He'd been delivered to the room in the early hours by 2 people whose identity remained a mystery due to me pretending to be asleep at the time. Billy was swearing and there was a lot of banging about, but I just lay still. I wanted no part of whatever had happened. After a couple of hours, I woke up again and rolled Billy over to reveal his badly swollen face. It was clear he'd been in a bit of bother. I went down to breakfast and the atmosphere was terrible. The lads were saying, 'Have you heard about last night? Billy's in a lot of trouble.'" The SFA acted swiftly after the story broke, and by Monday, a disciplinary committee that included Celtic director Tom Devlin had met and handed out lifetime bans to all 5 players, without giving them a chance to put forward their own version of events. The Daily Record of the 9th of September 1975 reported, "Celtic star Pat McCluskey, pale, dishevelled and visibly shocked, went into hiding at his father-in-law's home in Springboyd, Glasgow, after hearing of the decision. He said, 'I just can't say anything. First thing tomorrow morning, I'll have to see the club and Mr. Sean Fallon, the assistant manager.'" Pat McCluskey was still only 23, but had established himself as a key member of the Celtic team and acquitted himself admirably in European Cup semi-final ties against Inter Milan and Atletico Madrid. the last of the Quality Street gang generation to make the first team breakthrough, he was equally at home in central defence or midfield and seemed to have a long and successful career in front of him. But just over 2 years later, he was packed off to Dumbarton without ceremony, despite reported interest from Newcastle United, and it's impossible not to think the escapade in Copenhagen had nothing at all to do with it. He was taken off injured in the match against Dundee and did not play in midweek in the League Cup tie against Stenhousemuir, where the 16-year-old Roy Aitken made his debut as a substitute, and was also missing from the lineup against Motherwell at Fir Park on the 15th of September, for what proved to be the last match George Connelly ever played for the club. In May 1973, George Connelly was voted the Scottish Football Writers' Player of the Year, and the match at Fir Park was almost 2 years to the day since he played in the Scotland team that defeated Czechoslovakia 2-1 at Hampden in September 1973 to qualify for the 1974 World Cup. After another starring performance for Scotland in November 1973, Connelly briefly went on strike in sympathy with Davy Hay before quickly returning to the club, but it would be months before he started another game, and this initial walkout signalled the decline of his career. 2 walkouts in season 1974-75 followed before he returned in the summer, staying in Glasgow to train while the rest of the first team toured Ireland. He had come on as a substitute in the first 2 league matches, and this was his first start since a 1-1 draw at Celtic Park against Morton on the 5th of April. Motherwell would prove awkward opponents for Celtic in 1975-76, winning at Celtic Park in November and knocking Celtic out of the Scottish Cup at Fir Park in January. With Vic Davidson just signed on a free transfer from Celtic, they took a 1-0 lead. The former Celtic striker firing home after a corner kick to the back post was headed back in by Colin McAdam. Kenny Dalglish equalised for Celtic just before half-time. Motherwell keeper Stuart Rennie made a brilliant save from a Tom Callaghan penalty kick, awarded after the keeper dropped the ball at the feet of Bobby Lennox, whose goal-bound shot was punched off the line by defender Stuart McLaren. Motherwell deserved at least a point though, as they spurned several chances and Willie Pettigrew slammed a low shot off the post. It was an uncomfortable afternoon for Connelly in his final match, John Rafferty writing in The Scotsman of the 15th of September 1975. So busy was Shuggy Edwardson that he did not have time to become a character. Roddy MacDonald came through a testing afternoon with credit marks, but George Connelly had some of the elegance brushed from his play. Tom Callaghan struggled a bit, and the great Celtic were seen in disarray at times as Motherwell swept in. After only 3 Premier Division matches, Celtic were already 3 points behind Rangers and in 4th place behind Dundee United and Hibernian, who were both on 4 points, and it was shaping up to be a very difficult season. In midweek, Celtic flew to Reykjavik to play their first European Cup Winners' Cup tie in 10 years against Valor, and Sean Fallon was contemplating restoring Pat McCluskey. Alan Davidson reported in the Evening Times of the 15th of September 1975. The young defender, one of the now infamous Copenhagen Five, was dropped by the Parkhead club at the weekend after revelations of his behaviour while with the Scotland international party in Denmark 2 weeks ago. While Celtic were drawing 1-1 with Motherwell in a Premier League match at Fir Park, McCluskey had to content himself with reserve football at Parkhead. But he's a player of character and skill, and that's what Celtic will need in their side when they face Valor in the first leg of their first round European Cup Winners' Cup tie. The Icelanders are an aggressive race, and they want desperately to beat Celtic. But that shouldn't be interpreted as a slight against Scotland. Any foreigners are fair game. In such a situation, McCluskey appears to be the man for the job. He's hard, he's skillful, and, no matter the standard of opposition, he's committed. Sean Fallon, in charge of the squad here, gave me a broad hint as to his plans when, this morning, he told me, "I'm thinking about a change from Saturday's team. It's between Paddy McCluskey and George Connelly for the sweeper's job. I wasn't entirely happy with the defensive set-up on Saturday. However, I want to see everyone in training tonight, and then I'll finally decide on the team." Tonight's will be Celtic's first training session since they flew into this cold and desolate part of Iceland yesterday. Unfortunately, a waterlogged pitch prevented that training session from taking place, and Pat McCluskey was given the nod for the 2-0 win over a side containing Johannes Edvaldsson's brother. Shuggy was made captain for the occasion and missed a twice-taken penalty, putting his first effort wide of the post, while the keeper saved the second. It was a much easier win than the scoreline suggests, and Connelly was an unused substitute. He was never to wear a Celtic jersey again. On Monday the 22nd of September, Connelly didn't so much walk as run out of Celtic Park in the middle of a training session, and amidst feverish press speculation, the story broke 3 days later. Connelly remembers in his autobiography, Celtic's Lost Legend, written with Brian Cooney. The clock was ticking furiously towards a time of reckoning, and it came suddenly one morning. I was running around the park, getting hammered in training, with sweat pouring down my body. I felt that my world was about to explode and fragment in front of my eyes, and, all of a sudden, I knew I just couldn't be bothered anymore. I knew by then that my marriage was over, and there was no going back. I also knew that my time with my beloved Celtic had juddered to a halt for the last time. I wanted out. I wanted an escape tunnel. There was no need to look for one, really. I had been digging it for a couple of years, and it was there, waiting for me to enter it. Connelly's problems seem to have been many and varied. A natural shyness and aversion to the limelight, a refusal to allow himself to become too close to his teammates, a failing marriage, problems with alcohol, and they were all coming to a head. He continues in Celtic's Lost Legend. Oh, it could all have been different. If Davy hadn't gone to London, if I'd had a different kind of marriage, if I'd met someone who'd have been right for me and I'd been right for her, if I'd lived life more traditionally instead of back to front. I even decided I'd have been better going down the pits first and finding something out about the world and its ways before going into football. And I thought about all those guys I'd never allowed myself to get close to. Jinky, Bobby and Billy. They were all city boys who knew the score, whereas I had just been a village boy trying to learn from them. Billy, my hero, was especially prominent in my thoughts. The best Celtic player there has ever been as far as I was concerned. Do you know my hair started going grey when I was in my 20s? I can mind Big Billy calling me Jeff Chandler, but it didn't bother me. You can accept anything from your hero. In the middle of this training session, Connelly ran off the pitch, got changed hurriedly in the dressing room and left before anyone could try to speak to him. Jim Blair wrote in the Evening Times of Thursday the 25th of September 1975, "Today at Parkhead, I spoke to caretaker manager Sean Fallon, who confirmed that Connelly hasn't been seen at the ground since Monday. He walked out during training, Fallon told me, and I haven't seen or heard from him since. Obviously we, as a club, are now looking for an explanation from the player." This was not George Connelly's third walkout on Celtic. It was merely the third that was known about outside the club. But this time, there was a sense of finality, with many in the press reporting that now Celtic's patience had finally run out. In a sympathetic piece in The Scotsman on the 26th of September 1975, John Rafferty wrote, "The Fife village boy never could adjust to the urban excitements and the exaggerated emotionalism which bears on the star football player. Indeed, he would be more fitted emotionally to being a long-distance lorry driver, to have his quiet pint in a local and play his football on a park levelled at the foot of a pit bing. He was out of his element in the middle of the Celtic Rangers jungle." George Connelly has great football talent. Had he worked with the diligence and dedication of his teammate, Kenny Dalglish, then he would have been a player of world class. He has been at Celtic Park since he was 15 years old, and even at that age, he was giving demonstrations of his skill with the ball. Celtic suspended Connelly the first time he played truant. Sympathetically, they granted him leave of absence the second time. Now they can but shake their heads and hope for the best. In a far less sympathetic piece that same day, Hugh Taylor wrote in the Daily Record, "A blow-up at training on Monday was apparently the climax to days of frustration for Connelly, who thought he shouldn't have been out of the first team. I feel, however, that Celtic will no longer tolerate the prima donna antics of Connelly. The player obviously hasn't applied himself as he should at training. What happens to Connelly now? When he was put up for transfer, there was no noticeable rush for his signature. And what club now, in these days of cash shortages, would be willing to take a chance on a player who doesn't appear able to stand up to pressure? Connelly is a tragic case. He is a player of the highest calibre, but he can't iron out his problems. Neither can Celtic. Nowadays, discipline must come first. Celtic's patience is at an end. There will be no forgiving pat on the head for George Connelly this time." The sad story of the downfall of George Connelly still had one more chapter to run. He remained on Celtic's books until October 1976, when the returning Jock Stein would make one final desperate attempt to keep this troubled genius in the game. But, to all intents and purposes, his Celtic career was now over. The departure of Connelly was the second hammer blow to hit Celtic in the opening months of season 1975-76. Shortly before his final walkout, the influential Steve Murray was forced to call time on his career because of a troublesome toe injury which surgery that summer had failed to heal. Had he been fit, Murray would very probably have succeeded Billy McNeill as captain of Celtic and played through the pain barrier for most of the previous season. Bill McFarlane reported in the Sunday Post of the 7th of September 1975, "Steve Murray is finished with football." That was the sad news revealed by Celtic's assistant boss Sean Fallon following yesterday's match against Dundee. Murray recently had an operation for a bone growth on the big toe of his right foot. He has been in almost continuous pain since November, and all summer fought a long, lonely battle in a bid to get fit. Last week, his doctor told him he must not play again. The classy wing half joined Celtic on May the 1st, 1973 from Aberdeen for £50,000 and played 105 first-team games. Last night, Sean was lavish in his praise for the man described by his teammates as a player's player. It's unfortunate to lose a player of Steve's ability for football in general. He was a great sportsman on and off the park, and a great servant. Sean Fallon would have had a huge task filling in for Jock Stein, even if the playing squad had been settled and in good shape as he took over. As it was, he had to take over the weakest Celtic squad in over a decade, and had now lost two of its best players in the most frustrating of circumstances. Even allowing for the failure to win a match against Rangers that season, it makes the performances he was able to coax out of a hugely depleted squad over the autumn and winter of 1975-76 all the more remarkable. October began with a 7-0 win at home over Valor to seal a 9-0 aggregate win, with debuts as substitutes for George McCluskey and Jim Casey. And 3 days later, Harry Hood scored his final goal for the club in a 3-1 win over Hearts at Celtic Park. This was followed on the 11th of October with a gritty 2-1 win over Aberdeen at Pittodrie, in which Paul Wilson, normally the most mild-mannered of players, was sent off after only 12 minutes for throwing the ball at Eddie Thompson after being fouled by the Dons defender. Bill McFarlane in the Sunday Post of the 12th of October 1975 considered this the turning point of the game, in Celtic's favour. The effect on Celtic? They simply rolled up sleeves and played as well as they've done in their long, illustrious history. This victory must rate as one of their best, not just for the courage it required by 10 men, but for the attractive, entertaining way they set about things. Most sides would have closed ranks and settled for a draw in the circumstances, but not Celts. In Dalglish and McGrain, they had world-class players. Two first-half goals by Kenny Dalglish and Dixie Deans, combined with a 3-0 defeat for Rangers against Ayr United at Somerset Park, catapulted Celtic to the top of the league, 1 point ahead of Rangers after 7 matches, after the loss of 3 points in their first 3 matches. At the close of play 7 days later, they were still top, in the most bizarre, and for Hibernian, infuriating circumstances. Central Scotland had been covered in a thick shroud of fog for a couple of days, with both Glasgow and Prestwick airports being forced to cancel all takeoffs and landings on Friday the 17th of October. The following day, Hibs came to Celtic Park and were leading 2-0 in the final 10 minutes when the fog descended again and Celtic's bête noire, Bobby Davidson, decided the match could not continue. Jack Harkness reported in the Sunday Post of the 19th of October 1975. The first warning bell sounded about 15 minutes from time when the fog thickened. Through the mist, we noticed there was trouble on the terracing. A section of the crowd invaded the field and play was stopped. Sean Fallon came onto the field. After a talk with the referee, he went over to the crowd and appealed to them to go back to their places. Play restarted, but only for 2 minutes. Referee Davidson consulted a linesman for fully 5 minutes. As the referee debated, players hung around in groups and the home supporters whistled like mad, informing the referee the game should be abandoned. It was probably the most difficult decision Bobby Davidson has ever had to make. There were Hibs winning a game that could ultimately decide the league championship. Naturally, the referee took his time. Finally, and dramatically, he held up both hands, indicating it was all over. Game abandoned. In my opinion, the referee made the correct decision. Hibs were understandably incensed by the decision and complained to the league, but the governing body agreed with the opinion of most observers that Davidson had called this one correctly. When the match was replayed on the 10th of December, it ended in a 1-1 draw. Everything on the field seemed to be going as well as could have been expected that season, but then the League Cup final was lost 1-0 to Rangers, who, by the simple expedient of having Tom Forsyth kick Kenny Dalglish up and down the pitch for 90 minutes, blotted out Celtic's attacking threat. John Rafferty's match report in The Scotsman of the 27th of October 1975 gives us a sense of how far Celtic had fallen in only a couple of seasons. Rangers won because it was an old-fashioned game. They ran and challenged, and a few years ago, when the term was fashionable, we would have been commending them for their work rate. They played it hard and straightforward, as these games used to be played. Celtic, on the other hand, tried to play it as their good teams of a few years back used to, but without the talent they had then. One could not help wondering what some of those teams would have done about the man-for-man marking which Rangers adopted. In the second half, Wilson showed what could be done when he took Rangers centre-half Jackson for walks out to the flag at centre field, but Celtic had not the quality to take advantage of the gap. One can imagine what such as Johnston, Auld, Chalmers and Wallace would have done. The Celtic forwards on Saturday were arguably their least effective since the war. Celtic made an official complaint after the game about the selection of Bill Anderson, who was not one of the 7 Scottish referees on the FIFA list to take charge of the game, and who failed to send off Tom Forsyth, despite some very suspect challenges, particularly on Dalglish and McGrain. Ken Gallagher wrote in the Daily Record of the 27th of October 1975, Fallon did not criticise referee Bill Anderson's handling of the game, but clearly Celtic were unhappy about the performance of the man who was at one time on our FIFA list and then lost that position. Their main anger surrounded the second half fouls by Rangers defender Tom Forsyth. For one, against Danny McGrain, he was booked. Minutes later, he fouled Kenny Dalglish, and that should have brought an ordering off. Instead, Anderson took no action. That was his major error of judgment in a game which was never easy to handle. The League Cup final was followed by a 1-1 draw between the teams the following Saturday, with Paul Wilson scoring a 78th minute equaliser after a defensive mix-up allowed Derek Parlane to put Rangers ahead 3 minutes before. The draw left Celtic still a point ahead in the title race, and a 3-1 win over Boa Vista at Celtic Park, when they wore numbers on the hoops for the first time following a new UEFA directive, secured progression to the quarter-finals of the European Cup Winners' Cup. But this was followed by 2 league defeats to Dundee at Dens Park and at home to Motherwell, either side of a 7-2 win over Ayr United at Somerset Park, in which Johannes Edvaldsson scored a hat-trick. The 2-0 loss to Motherwell was a top-of-the-table clash, decided by a Willie Pettigrew double, while Andy Lynch and Bobby Lennox both struck the post, watched by Bayern Munich assistant manager Werner Olk, who was accused of tapping up Pettigrew after the game. Motherwell had recently turned down £100,000 offers from Aston Villa and Manchester City for a player who was giving every indication of developing into a top-draw striker. The Premier Division table now showed Rangers and Motherwell on 15 points, with Celtic and Hibernian on 14. Both had a game in hand over the top two. The only other league defeat before the turn of the year came on the 13th of December in a 2-0 home defeat to Aberdeen. 3-1 wins over Hibernian and Ayr United sent Celtic to Ibrox on New Year's Day 3 points ahead of their closest rivals at the halfway stage of the campaign. The Sunday Post of the 28th of December 1975 reported that Steve Murray was back playing for the reserves as he attempted to make a comeback, but unfortunately, after only a couple of first-team appearances in January 1976, he was forced to call time again. A third defeat of the season to Rangers at Ibrox on the 1st of January 1976 reduced Celtic's lead at the top to a single point. But unlike the previous season, when this had precipitated a calamitous collapse in form, they continued plugging away and stayed at the top of the league into April. An impressive victory was won at Fir Park on the 10th of January when Steve Murray made his first start since the Glasgow Cup final in May 1975, and his performance that day gives a glimpse of what might have been had he not been unavailable for so long and if he had not had to retire again so quickly. Ken Gallagher reported in the Daily Record of the 12th of January 1976, Murray, who had not played a full first-team game since last season's Glasgow Cup final against Rangers because of injury, tired a little in the Motherwell mud. That was understandable. It wasn't so easy to understand, though, how his skills could remain as sharp after such a long time out of the game. Murray's brief return allowed Edvaldsson to sweep up behind MacDonald and McCluskey in defence, with McGrain and Lynch pushing forward, and this brought out one of Kenny Dalglish's best performances in some weeks. 2 goals from Dixie Deans and a late clincher from Dalglish sealed the win. The same 11 went to the traditionally difficult venue of Muirton Park the following week and won 4-3, Johannes Edvaldsson snatching a last-second winner. But sometime that week, Steve Murray suffered a broken toe and was eventually forced to retire for the second time. The Sunday Post reported on the 25th of January 1976. Yesterday at Fir Park should have been Steve Murray's third comeback game for Celtic, and both player and club were delighted at the way the classy wing half had shaken off a toe injury which came close to ending his career. Sadly, like the best-laid schemes of mice and men, the Parkhead planning has gone aglee. For Steve has now broken a toe, on the same foot that was giving all the trouble. When he left us on Thursday, he seemed okay, team boss Sean Fallon told me yesterday. But Steve phoned this morning and told me he had a broken toe. Steve, however, still has his eye on Celtic's quarter-final tie against Sachsenring and beyond. That is still his target, helping Celtic to become the first British club to do the big European double. Without Murray, Celtic went down to a 3-2 defeat in the third round of the Scottish Cup at Fir Park, their earliest exit since 1968, in what was a severe blow to Sean Fallon, and has perhaps coloured perceptions of his spell as caretaker boss ever since. A spectacular 25-yard free kick from Kenny Dalglish opened the scoring before an Andy Lynch header saw them 2-0 ahead at half-time. But a combination of defensive slackness and a goalkeeping blunder by Peter Latchford, who had been performing brilliantly all season, saw it turn in Motherwell's favour. Doug Bailey wrote significantly in the Sunday Post of the 25th of January 1975. In the end, Celtic can have no excuses. They were well beaten, and to make matters worse, one or two of Sean's boys stopped pulling their weight when Motherwell started getting it all together. McGrain, McNamara, Deans, Dalglish, McCluskey and Lennox can disassociate themselves with that last remark. Looking back on the season half a century later, knowing Rangers would win the treble in May, it's easy to get the impression that this cup exit was symptomatic of a rudderless club enduring a nightmare season. But they then embarked on a long winning run, the only competitive games they failed to win between the end of January and the beginning of April being the European Cup Winners' Cup ties against the East Germans Sachsenring's Zwickau. In the first leg, on the 3rd of March 1976, Celtic hammered relentlessly at the Zwickau goal, but could not find a way through. Hugh Taylor reported in the Daily Record of the 4th of March 1976, Celtic were magnificently on top for most of the game, and in that remarkable second half, Zwickau were only twice anywhere near Latchford's penalty area. International goalkeeper Jurgen Kroy made acrobatic saves. At times only a miracle seemed to prevent the ball going into the German net. But Celtic's venom did not match their outfield play. They missed chances, even a penalty. This tragedy came in the 24th minute when Bobby Lennox allowed Kroy to leap easily and save his high shot after Kenny Dalglish had been brought down in the penalty area. Most of the papers the following day picked out Kenny Dalglish and Danny McGrain as being head and shoulders above the rest of the team. But it was hard not to think of the talent that had so recently hemorrhaged from Celtic Park, as Ian Archer alluded to in the Glasgow Herald of the 4th of March 1976. On a cool, balmy evening, there was the same expectancy in the car park outside, and the same hush in the minutes that preceded the tie. It was all as before, with the exception that Celtic, bereft of the most gifted players in recent years, could not break down a heavily manned defence. Dalglish and McGrain combined to finally break down the Zwickau defence 5 minutes from half-time, Danny winning the ball on the right and playing a perfect pass into Dalglish's path to arrow a shot in off the far post. Celtic were even more on the offensive in the second half, but try as they might, they could not find a second, and maybe for the first, but not the last time in Europe, they were punished for chasing another and forgetting about not conceding a goal at home. Roy Aitken had recently been introduced into the first team, and, still only 16, it was he who was left on the halfway line with one German forward in the dying seconds of the match as Celtic threw everything into scoring what could have proved a vital second goal. Hugh Taylor reported in the Daily Record, Celtic were a perspiring wave of green and white in the German penalty area when the ball was desperately cleared. On the halfway line, there were two lonely figures, Ludwig Blank of Zwickau and young Roy Aitken of Celtic. The German saw his chance and took it. With a devastating burst of speed, he was past the Celt, and although he was frantically chased, he dashed on to place the ball in the net. The almost 50,000 fans present left the ground in funereal silence, knowing that this result made it almost a certainty they would be progressing no farther in the competition that season. The squad had been hit with a flu bug in the days before the Zwickau match, and by the Saturday, 7 players were out of action and the match against Ayr United was postponed. It was originally to be played in midweek, but by Monday, the Scotsman reported, following the postponement of Saturday's Premier Division match with Ayr United, flu-stricken Celtic have decided to close their ground until Wednesday. No player will be allowed near Celtic Park until then, said acting manager Sean Fallon. The decision must put the match with Ayr United, now due on Wednesday, in doubt again. The match was indeed postponed again on the Wednesday, and with Rangers also hit by the flu bug, what might have been a title decider on Saturday the 13th of March was also postponed. So it was that Celtic played no matches between the two legs of the Zwickau tie. As the team prepared to fly out from Glasgow Airport for the second leg on the 15th of March, Johnny Doyle was signed in a club record £90,000 deal from Ayr United. Doyle had been sent off in his last match against Celtic in December for an altercation with his marker, Andy Lynch, but he was a Celtic fanatic, as the Daily Record reported on the 16th of March 1976. Doyle signed for the club at the airport to beat today's transfer deadline. Ayr manager Alex Stewart was obviously sad to see the player leave his club. It was only fair to let Doyle go. All he wants to do is play football, and he has always wanted to play for Celtic. In the end, we could not stand in his way, and the money will come in useful to us in our bid to strengthen our team. We want players who will want to play for Ayr, just as Doyle wants to play for Celtic. Doyle was obviously delighted with the move, and he was raring to go in the green and white of his favourite club. Still suffering the effects of the flu bug that kept Andy Lynch, Dixie Deans and Bobby Lennox out of the side, with several players including McGrain and Dalglish only just over the worst of it, Celtic went down to a 1-0 defeat, despite again having most of the play, and a Roddy McDonald goal ruled out for an infringement on 86 minutes. There was a feeling that they had been very unfortunate over the two legs, but a certain lack of cutting edge and tactical naivety had cost them dearly against modest opposition. Zwickau would be eliminated 5-0 on aggregate by Anderlecht in the semi-finals. On their return from East Germany, wins over Dundee, Motherwell and St Johnstone followed, with the 4-0 dismantling of Motherwell at Celtic Park being particularly impressive. There was a real air of optimism around the club, and following the demolition of Motherwell, Ian Archer reported in the Glasgow Herald of the 29th of March 1976. Celtic's long and difficult pursuit of the Scottish Championship in a season of renewal is now only 8 games away from success. There was whistling and good banter in the Parkhead corridors yesterday as the club considered the prospect. 4 goals against Motherwell were a matter of some pride. Recent results were a cause for some comfort. Sean Fallon poured a cup of tea and explained. Last time round in this Premier League, we lost to Dundee and to Motherwell. We've now beaten them in this last leg, and their 2 difficult matches over. We haven't lost in the league since January the 1st, and we are playing well. You look at your record books. That's 8 matches all won, and in the last 4 games, we haven't conceded a goal. Will it come down to a decider against Rangers? I just don't know. There's a lot of awkward matches against sides who will be worried about relegation, but it's a good position to be in. Those last 4 shutouts have been important because Roy Aitken has been the centre-half in all of them. I know a lot of people say it's a lot to ask of a schoolboy to play there, but he's good enough and he hasn't let us down. Archer added, Celtic, with each passing week, must be given new respect. To be in front of Rangers in the same 12 months as their manager was taken out of the contest, and Billy McNeill, Jimmy Johnston, George Connelly, Jim Brogan and Steve Murray all departed, is an achievement in itself. If they are not the side they were, they are a most acceptable imitation. They may just prove the old axiom in sport that success is judged not by comparison with times past, but the number of medals in the pocket. The Saturday after Archer wrote this, a 1-0 win over St Johnstone at Celtic Park kept Celtic a point ahead at the top into the second week of April. And then the wheels came off. In the space of 2 weeks in April, Celtic dropped 7 points in 4 matches, losing away at Tannadice and Easter Road and at home to Ayr United, the only point from that spell coming from a 1-1 draw with Aberdeen at Celtic Park. There was no championship decider with Rangers, who came to Celtic Park on the 26th of April, already confirmed as champions for the 2nd year in a row. It ended in a 0-0 draw, but Hugh Taylor in the Daily Record of the 27th of April 1976 saw cause for optimism in Celtic's display, inspired by a young Tommy Burns. A red-haired inspiration gave Celtic hope for next season in the match against Rangers at Parkhead last night. His name is Tommy Burns, and this slim youngster made a tremendous hit in the midfield. His skilled control and accurate passing put Celtic into the shape their fans had demanded all year. Certainly, Burns was the man of the match, which had moments of drama and excitement, but never reached the heights expected of an Old Firm match. Celtic left the pitch with thousands of Rangers fans chanting their victory songs, which had helped the Ibrox club to win the new Premier League title. Celtic too walked off shaking their heads. No wonder. They should have won this match comfortably. They had nearly all the pressure, were in command of the midfield, but despite the promptings of Burns and Kenny Dalglish, their old failing was always obvious: lack of venom. The 6-point gap between Celtic and Rangers at the end of the season suggests a comfortable win for Rangers and a mediocre season for Celtic. But until that final 3-week collapse, it could have gone either way. Sean Fallon deserves great credit for the way he led Celtic through an incredibly difficult time, but he was to find the board of directors quite unforgiving as the end of the season saw major changes at the club. The first indication of this came at the beginning of May when Harry Hood, whose appearances had become increasingly sporadic as the season progressed, was given a free transfer. It was the loss of another link to a glorious era in Celtic history. While Bobby Lennox was the last of the Lisbon Lions, he was also the only remaining member of the team who played Feyenoord in the 1970 European Cup final. Hood and Tom Callaghan were the only remaining players who had been on the bench that disastrous evening in Milan. Callaghan would shortly follow Hood out of the club, and by the summer of 1976, there was a real feeling that those glory days were gone. Ian Broadley reported in the Daily Record of the 30th of April 1976. Hood, who won 10 major Scottish honours in his career with Celtic, said, "I'm disappointed at leaving Parkhead in the only season I've known without winning anything. I'd like to play in America during the summer. I could get match fit over there for the new season. I'm still capable of playing first-class football and can give another club several good years." Hood spent that summer playing for San Antonio Thunder in the North American Soccer League before playing for Motherwell the following season and winding up his career at Queen of the South in 1977-78. His departure was only the beginning of the changes. The next change was a welcome one, when Jock Stein, 10 months after his horrific car crash, returned to take up the reins again, and his first game back in charge was a joint testimonial match against Manchester United for Jimmy Johnston and Bobby Lennox, a pair who had been inseparable over their long Celtic careers until Johnston's release 12 months before. Jack Harkness wrote in the Sunday Post of the 16th of May 1976, "It's great to be back," Jock told me last night, "and although I'm not yet 100% fit, I fully expect to be A1 after a long rest this summer. But I must say a word about the great job Sean has done under very difficult circumstances. No man could have done more. He's brought in some great young players who could be the backbone of the side, which I hope will see us back on top next season. In fact, some of these lads will get their chance to show what they are made of against Manchester United. Make no mistake, it's going to be some match. Neither club ever plays friendlies. Both will be out to win, so no kid could have a better baptism than that." 4 days after Danny McGrain and Kenny Dalglish inspired Scotland to a 2-1 win over England at Hampden, which had Jack Harkness in the Sunday Post opining that if some of the England team were worth $250,000, McGrain must be worth £1 million. Celtic demolished the FA Cup holders 4-0, Kenny Dalglish turning in another masterclass in build-up play and finishing as he netted a hat-trick after Bobby Lennox opened the scoring. Even as the fans exulted in the excellence of Dalglish and McGrain, there was a reminder of what Celtic had lost, both on the pitch and in the stand, after Billy Connolly entertained the crowd beforehand, refereeing an Old Crocs match while wearing a Rangers scarf and being theatrically stretchered off exhausted at the end. With Jinky rolling back the years on the right wing, the Celtic defence was bolstered by Davy Hay, making a guest appearance 2 years after leaving for Chelsea, that had the fans chanting for his permanent return. Ian Archer reported in the Glasgow Herald of the 18th of May 1976. But the most impressive performance of the season's finale, which started with Billy Connolly, complete with a Rangers scarf, refereeing an old-timers match, came from Davy Hay, back on Parkhead for the first time since his £250,000 transfer to Chelsea. One wondered, as one saw his insistent running and tackling, if the Ibrox boardroom would be so heavy with trophies had he still been earning his living in Kerrydale Street. It's not a stretch, especially given how close Celtic had come to actually regaining the title, to imagine that there would indeed have been far fewer trophies adorning the Ibrox boardroom since 1974. Sadly, Hay would never return to Celtic permanently as a player, and his move to Chelsea, in a playing sense at least, had not been a great one for him. He had endured an injury-hit spell at Stamford Bridge, and the testimonial appearance was geared towards helping him back to full fitness. Due to injury, he never played for Scotland again after starring at the 1974 World Cup, and he was forced to call time on his playing career due to injury in 1979. While Hay's performance on the field reminded Celtic fans of what they had lost, watching from the stand was another former member of the Quality Street gang, Lou Macari. He had been expected to turn out for United, but was unable, it was later claimed, to bring himself to play against Celtic. In other circumstances, the past two very difficult seasons would have undoubtedly turned out very differently if Hay and Macari had still been at the club. Despite Jock Stein's words of praise for Sean Fallon and his efforts throughout Celtic's most difficult season since the early 1960s, it was his long-serving assistant who paid the price for a trophyless season in a summer of reorganisation behind the scenes. The first inkling of change came on the 23rd of May when news broke that Queen's Park coach Dave McParland would be joining Celtic, but the exact role he would fill was initially cloaked in mystery. Bill McFarlane reported in the Sunday Post that day, "Celtic chairman Desmond White wouldn't be drawn when I spoke to him, but he did tell me, we have approached Davy McParland and he accepted a position in the top echelon at Parkhead. He's a very bright young man and will play a vital role in the future of the club. There will be other changes within the club and they will be made known in the fullness of time. I do not propose, at this moment, to go into them in detail." Davy McParland was also keeping things dark. He told me, "I have enjoyed my stay with Queen's, but when I was approached by Celtic, I was delighted to accept. My official title will be announced by Mr. White sometime next week." So, as Jock Stein flew out to Spain on holiday, a wind of change was blowing around Parkhead. One big move will involve Sean Fallon. I expect him to get greater responsibility in the scouting system as well as his normal duties. McFarlane was thinking along the right lines, but, in effect, Sean Fallon was demoted that summer, being named chief scout in a backroom reshuffle that saw McParland replace him as assistant manager, breaking up the partnership that had taken Celtic to the top of the European game. Celtic tried to present it in a positive light, Alex Cameron reporting almost 2 weeks later in the Daily Record of the 4th of June 1976. Celtic last night gave Sean Fallon the vital job of running an accelerated youth policy in a new Parkhead hierarchy. Dave McParland, who is quitting Queen's Park, will be coach, directly responsible to manager Jock Stein, who remains the supremo with the absolute backing of the board. Celtic directors met last night and the number one item was recruitment. Every division of Scottish football will be combed for young talent which the club wants to find and train quickly. Chairman Desmond White said, "I can tell you now that this new concept was envisaged a year ago, but had to be postponed because of Mr. Stein's unfortunate car accident. The idea is basically to get the best young players to Parkhead. Mr. Fallon is being asked to guide this." The Celtic board will give no guidelines about McParland's function. This will be up to Stein to decide. Obviously, however, he will be a man in a tracksuit, taking at least part of the load off the manager's shoulders. McParland, who might easily have stayed out of football altogether when he dramatically quit Partick Thistle, has the football world at his feet. Clearly, he is the heir apparent to one of the best but most demanding jobs in football. If he does well, McParland is certain to be the next manager of Celtic. It is going to be an exceptionally testing year at Parkhead. Stein has to try to stride back into a job he has missed for a year while he recovered from injury. The Celtic players have the challenge of trying to win back their position from treble-winning Rangers. Danny McGrain, in his autobiography in Sunshine Orange Shadow, written with Hugh Keevins, reiterated his belief that Fallon was let down badly by certain players in the squad. The blunt truth was that Celtic did not have enough good players out on the park, but, as is usually the way, it was the person at the helm, in this case Sean Fallon, who got the blame. He was stripped of his title of assistant manager to be replaced by Davy McParland and given the post of youth development officer. Not much of a way, I remember thinking at the time, for Sean to celebrate his silver jubilee at Celtic Park. The poor efforts of some players with the club contributed towards Sean being demoted, and for that I used to wonder how those individuals concerned could get to sleep at night. Changes in the playing personnel were also being put in motion in the summer of 1976. And perhaps the highest profile departure was that of Dixie Deans, who was quoted in the papers at the time as saying there were no hard feelings over his exit, but who makes it plain in his autobiography that he was far from happy about his time at the club being brought to an end. Deans had enjoyed a hugely successful 5-year stint at Celtic since signing in 1971, and still only 29, clearly thought he still had more to offer. Dixie writes in his autobiography that a row and falling out with Jock Stein over being left out of the team to play Manchester United precipitated his departure. I was really looking forward to it until Jock pulled the rug from under me and told me I wouldn't be playing. As usual, I couldn't pin him down on a reason, and I blew my stack. It was the first time I had fronted him up about being left out of a team since the Inter Milan game 4 years earlier. On that occasion, it was an arm around the shoulder job and a quiet pep talk. Not this time. In the heat of the moment, we both said things I'm sure we didn't mean. All I wanted was to pay my own tribute to Jimmy, by now playing for Sheffield United, and Bobby, along with 50,000 other Celtic fans. I watched from the stand as the pair of them ran a lap of honour at full time, and Jimmy, the tears running down his face, chucked his boots into the jungle. Ironically, had I played that night, it would have been my last game for Celtic, as well as Jimmy's. Deans received a phone call from Stein while he was visiting his brother in Chelmsford that summer, and was told to call Luton Town manager Harry Haslam to talk terms. Twice Dixie called Stein at Celtic Park, protesting he did not want to leave, and twice Stein told him to sign for Luton and hung up. Reluctantly, Deans put pen to paper, and despite joining a club in the old second division, he actually doubled his weekly wage when he signed on at Kenilworth Road, and with his departure, another link with the glory years of the Stein era was gone. The departures of Harry Hood and Dixie Deans signalled a summer and autumn of change at Celtic, and the beginning of a new, distinct phase of the Jock Stein era. The manager's first Celtic team had taken the club to 2 European Cup finals. His second team, based around the Quality Street gang and a few judicious signings, had taken them to 2 more European Cup semi-finals, and it was his tragedy that just as the gang should have been at the peak of their careers, they had one by one slipped through his fingers, and a third team would have to be built from the rubble of the previous 2 seasons. Danny McGrain remembers in Sunshine Orange Shadow, in a time of transition, Celtic also dispensed with Ali Hunter, Harry Hood and Dixie Deans. After less than 10 years at Celtic Park, Kenny Dalglish and myself had, in our mid-20s, become the elder statesmen of the side. The first big test for Jock Stein's new-look Celtic was a pre-season friendly, which turned out to be anything but friendly, against two times World Club champions Penarol on the 7th of August 1976, and the line-up for that match shows just how much Celtic had changed since the end of the 9-in-a-row run just 2 seasons before. Latchford, McGrain, Lynch, Glavin, MacDonald, Edvaldsen, Doyle, Dalglish, G. McCluskey, Burns, Wilson. Subs, Conahan, Aitken, P. McCluskey, Lennox. In a sign of the increasing commercialisation of football in the mid-70s, for the first time, the Celtic shirt sported the double diamond of kit manufacturers Umbro this season, and the match against Penarol was its first appearance in a home match after being worn in friendlies in the Highlands against Inverness Thistle and Ross County the previous week. Penarol started the match with some slick passing moves, but did not react well when Celtic finally got a grip of the midfield. Jack Harkness wrote in the Sunday Post of the 8th of August 1976, "Penarol were soon giving us a sample of the magnificent ball control and the noble art of stringing together a bevy of inch-perfect passes. But it wasn't long before Celtic got fed up watching. Up went their sleeves and they got stuck in a real old-fashioned way. Soon they were launching fierce assaults on the Penarol goal. Doyle should have scored when he fired one straight at the keeper. Glavin had Corbo bringing off what must have been the greatest save of his long career. Then George McCluskey out-dribbled the goalie inside the penalty area, only to see his parting lob sail narrowly past. So bewildered were Penarol by this pressure, they introduced some doubtful tactics. McCluskey opened the scoring from the penalty spot after Johnny Doyle was brought down in the box, and Kenny Dalglish made it 2, turning in a pass from Tommy Burns on 65 minutes. Harkness wrote, "The longer the game went, the more I became disappointed with Penarol's discipline. Their tactics had a familiar South American look about them. Once I closed my eyes when fullback Perveno made to tackle McGrain. I wasn't surprised when I opened them to see Danny lying on the ground in agony." There was an almost comical postscript written in the Sunday Post by Bill McFarlane, who reported the Penarol manager had complained afterwards that Celtic had been too physical. "Penarol don't like losing, and it showed," Jock Stein told me. "As soon as we hit our first goal, they introduced the needle into the game." Penarol boss Rocky Maspoli couldn't agree less. "Celtic were much too physical for my liking," he told me. "Their kind of tough play is foreign to what we're used to in South America. The two players who upset me most were Celtic's number 4, Glavin, and their number 10, Burns. Even my players complained to me about them in the dressing room." The undoubted star of the game was Danny McGrain, who was reaching a standard of excellence rarely seen before or since in a Celtic jersey. Ian Archer in the Glasgow Herald of the 9th of August 1976 joined Jock Stein in showering him with praise. "The best part of a savoury hors d'oeuvre to the season was Danny McGrain, the best of European fullbacks. Studiously he played, tackled and passed. Gently he complained about Penarol provocation. Gradually, he asserted himself on friend and foe. We've asked him to be more assertive this season. After all, if anything happened to Dalglish, he would be the captain. Honestly, when we played those matches in the north, he was worth the entrance money on his own, and he was just as good against Penarol," Stein added. Archer cautioned that the Celtic defence could still be a problem area, alluding to the following evening's Glasgow Cup final against Rangers, held over from the previous season. The defence was rarely bothered, but Latchford was faultless, MacDonald severe in the air. That area may still give the club problems, possibly tomorrow night, but at least they have gained some practice. He would be proven correct, Rangers winning 3-1 at Celtic Park after they were gifted a 2-goal start through poor defending in the first 10 minutes. But by the end of the month, the League Cup sectional phase had been safely negotiated. And on the day of the final match against Dundee United on the 1st of September, Jock Stein addressed these defensive concerns with a shock signing that caught everyone in the Scottish game unawares. Pat Stanton played under Stein at Hibernian as an 18-year-old in 1964. Over the next decade, he had come to personify the Easter Road Club, just as Billy McNeill did at Celtic and John Gregg at Rangers. A composed, intelligent midfielder, Stanton's exceptional reading of the game, timing in the tackle and range of passing won him 16 Scotland caps between 1966 and 1974, captaining the national side 3 times. A great-great-nephew of one of Hibernian's founders and their first captain, Michael Wheelahan, Stanton seemed to be part of the fixtures and fittings at Easter Road, but now, a few weeks short of his 32nd birthday, he had lost his place in the side, manager Eddie Turnbull considering his best days were now behind him. As the Celtic team prepared to take the field against Dundee United for that final League Cup sectional match, Stanton was in the building to sign his Celtic contract and was introduced to his new teammates in the dressing room shortly before kick-off. He was quoted in the Daily Record of the 2nd of September 1976. "I just can't believe it. It's like a dream. I've always had a soft spot for Celtic and I'm certainly looking forward to playing for them." In the Glasgow Herald that day, he alluded to having lost his place in the Hibernian team. "It's a completely new start and I just cannot wait to get into action. If I am chosen to face Rangers, then I could not have chosen a better game to start off. I'm really looking forward to it all. I had begun to have doubts about my future. Then this happens. I am over the moon. If a place like Parkhead cannot provide the perfect atmosphere for a player, then no other place can." The move caused shockwaves, not just because of what Pat Stanton meant to Hibernian, but also because he was a 32-year-old who had lost his place in their midfield, with the 23-year-old Jackie McNamara going the other way. But Stein was not planning to use Stanton in midfield. The new signing was being brought in to play alongside Roddy McDonald in the centre of defence, where his calming influence would transform the hitherto erratic Highlander into one of the most solid centre-backs in the country. Celtic really bought 2 players for the price of 1 in Pat Stanton, and his experience would prove invaluable as they sought to wrest back domination of the Scottish game from Rangers. As Pat Stanton settled in, the final chapter of the sad downfall of George Connelly was unfolding in the gritty environs of Brockville, where Stein had arranged a loan spell in one last, desperate bid to help him overcome his personal problems away from the often harsh limelight of Celtic Park. He made his debut for Falkirk on the 2nd of August 1976 in a 7-2 friendly defeat to Aberdeen, and seemed to be rediscovering his form with the Bairns. Referring to him as an ex-Celt, the Sunday Post of the 15th of August 1976 reported on a 1-1 League Cup draw with Hamilton. Ex-Celt George Connelly is really beginning to find his old touch. The ex-Celt's distribution was well nigh perfect. Having finally realised Connelly was not quite yet an ex-Celt, the Sunday Post reported on the 17th of October 1976. George Connelly is returning to Celtic from Falkirk, where he has been on loan for the past 3 months. The big sweeper, who has walked out on the Parkhead club twice and Scotland once, will be having talks about his future with Celtic boss Jock Stein this week. In his autobiography, Celtic's Lost Legend, written with Brian Cooney, Connelly remembers Jock Stein visiting him a few weeks before in an effort to save his professional career as it spiralled towards its end. One day, while I was still on trial with the Bairns, he suddenly appeared at my door and tried to work a miracle cure. That persuasive tongue of his was doing its best to chip away at the pig-headed obstinacy that had invaded my brain and was preventing me from playing the game I loved. He wanted me to make a Celtic return, and his message was simple. I could still have the life of a professional footballer. In other words, I had to stop the drinking, put some polish on my shoes and regain a bit of self-respect. He wanted me to forget the past and try to identify a future. "There's no reason you cannot come back," he said. "Instead of going to places like Brecon and Cowdenbeath, you can go to places like Ibrox and Kilmarnock." I cannot say it wasn't a tempting offer, but I just knew that the condition I was in at the time meant it was out of the question. I'd piled on so many pounds that I literally found it difficult to see my shoes for my belly. How long would it take to get that amount of weight off? Did I want to go through all the physical torture that Stein would have in mind for me? Did I need to go back into the pressure cooker of life that came with being a Celtic player? I hadn't been playing it fair as far as Falkirk was concerned, and, deep down, I knew that there was no chance of playing fair with Celtic again. So, as much as it grieved me to do it, I said no to the big man once again. When Connelly arrived at Celtic Park on the 18th of October 1976 for one last meeting with Stein, the manager finally acknowledged that there was nothing he could do, and one of the most talented players in Celtic history was quietly freed, hurrying out of the door to avoid seeing any of his former teammates who were out training on the pitch while he talked with Stein. So long and drawn out was Connelly's decline, the news merited only a few cursory paragraphs in the following day's Daily Record. Celtic handed a free transfer to problem boy George Connelly yesterday. The former Scottish international sweeper had been on loan to Falkirk since the season started. At the weekend, the Brockville club announced that they had ended the loan period, and yesterday, after a talk with Celtic manager Jock Stein at Parkhead, Connelly was released. Now he will be free to negotiate his own terms with any club who is interested in signing him. Connelly walked out on Celtic several times in a stormy career. His undoubted skills will probably be able to find him another club, even though he has not played for Celtic since September 1975. The signing of Pat Stanton then was a timely one, as only a player of his calibre could adequately replace a talent like George Connelly. He proved his worth on his debut against Rangers in the first league match of the season on the 4th of September. After Roddy McDonald hit the bar with an early header, the old defensive frailties were evident after only 9 minutes, when a mix-up between Peter Latchford and Andy Lynch left Derek Johnston to tap into an empty net. Despite having the better of the play, Celtic conceded again before half-time and looked down and out. But in the second half, they were utterly dominant, with Stanton dictating the flow. Mike Aitken reported in The Scotsman of the 6th of September 1976. The man at the heart of the change, of course, was Pat Stanton. He said afterwards that he had enjoyed the game immensely, and it showed in his appetite for the ball. Mind you, there was nothing fancy or elegantly laboured about his game. Like the greats, say Beckenbauer for one, he expended no more energy than was necessary, made time for himself, and gave the appearance of finding it all terribly simple. His passing was flawless, his availability constant, and his influence considerable. For the first time since Billy McNeil's departure, Celtic have a player who can give assurance and encouragement to the rest of the side, both by example and manner. Paul Wilson, who had developed a habit of scoring against Rangers over the past couple of years, pulled one back shortly after the interval. But time seemed to be slipping away until he picked up a Tommy Burns pass on the right flank, shimmied past John Gregg and ran into the box before rifling an unstoppable shot past McCloy in the Rangers goal. "Celtic are back in business," wrote Alan Heron in the Sunday Mail of the 5th of September 1976. But he was proven to be a little premature by results in the following weeks. A 1-0 defeat to Dundee United at Tannadice and a 2-2 home draw with Hearts, meaning they had to wait until their 4th league match that season before tasting victory. A 4-0 win over Kilmarnock at Rugby Park on the 25th of September. It was followed quickly by elimination from the UEFA Cup, in Celtic's first ever appearance in the competition in the first round, losing 2-0 to Wisła Krakow in Poland after a 2-2 draw at Celtic Park. Pat Stanton was ineligible for the European ties, having been signed too late to be registered for the first 3 rounds. On the scoresheet against Kilmarnock, in his second match for the club, was striker Joe Craig, signed in a £60,000 deal from Partick Thistle on the 17th of September. Celtic had been short in the striking department following the departure of Dixie Deans, and Jock Stein hinted at the reasons for Deans' exit when he spoke to Ken Gallagher in the Daily Record of the 18th of September 1976. The Parkhead move came swiftly, following the Premier League defeat at Tannadice and the midweek draw against the Polish team Wisła Krakow in the UEFA Cup. Yet it has been a move Stein has been contemplating for some time. He admitted yesterday, "I've liked the boy a lot when I've seen him, especially when I watched him in the under-23 team at Falkirk a while back. I thought then he could do a job for us, and I'm delighted to get him now. We needed someone with some height and strength up front. We allowed Dixie Deans to go for several reasons. We know he was better away from the club. Now we have a young player who can lead the line for us." Scoring the opening goal at Rugby Park with a diving header from a Kenny Dalglish corner kick, Craig sparked the rout of Kelly, and for the first time since his return to the helm, Jock Stein sounded in a bullish mood as his two new signings began to make their influence felt. Jim Reynolds wrote in the Glasgow Herald of the 27th of September 1976, "Jock very seldom makes predictions, but 48 hours before the Kilmarnock match, the Celtic manager forecast that his side would play well and get the result they wanted. When I spoke to him on Thursday night, he said that it was a long time since he had looked forward to a match so much. He told me, 'I honestly feel that things are beginning to happen again at Parkhead, and the possibilities in the near future are exciting. We can start at Kilmarnock where, I am sure, we will get a good result.' So it was little wonder he had that 'I told you so' look when I spoke to him at Parkhead again yesterday. He said, 'I obviously left myself wide open when I made the forecast, but that is how confident I felt about this match.' Stein's two recent signings, Pat Stanton and Joe Craig, have made all the difference. Stanton, playing at the back, has given the defence a solidity that has been missing since Billy McNeil left, and the players around him are thriving on a newfound confidence. Roddy McDonald, in particular, is already a much better player, and Peter Latchford, the goalkeeper, is showing the kind of form that won him under-23 caps for England. Without the ineligible Stanton and Craig, Celtic exited the UEFA Cup in Poland, and on their return on the Saturday, dropped another league point to Hibernian, which left them in 5th place in the league with 5 points from 5 matches. The win over Kilmarnock was beginning to look like a false dawn, and Doug Bailey wrote in the Sunday Post of the 3rd of October 1976, "In this football game, you have to be prepared to lead with your chin once in a while. So here goes. I'll eat my bunnet, and I chewed my way through a few last season if Hibs don't finish higher up the league than Celtic. For Eddie Turnbull's boys played some terrific neat possession stuff, designed to take the pith right out of Celts, which it did, and were pipped of a point by a refereeing decision which was surprising to say the least." Bailey did acknowledge that after Kenny Dalglish's penalty equaliser on 57 minutes, Hibernian were hanging on desperately for a point, and Ian Archer, in the Glasgow Herald of the 4th of October 1976, enthused about the performances of both teams, while pointing out that for the first time in decades, only a minority of the Celtic team was homegrown, and it would take time for them to gel. Celtic must have realised their predicament when they entered the transfer market. Theirs is now a team acquired rather than reared. Peter Latchford, Andy Lynch, Pat Stanton, Ronnie Glavin, Joe Craig and Johnny Doyle have all been bought. The investment is not short of £300,000. That, with good leadership, should make money talk, but it will take time. As Stein points out, we are having to change our side all the time because of eligibility rules in Europe and the League Cup. It will take time to settle, but there are signs that they are getting to know each other's play. A 2-0 win over Ayr United at Somerset Park on the 16th of October, with goals from the increasingly influential Ronnie Glavin and Joe Craig, meant they were only 3 points behind league leaders Dundee United, who had a 100% record and a game in hand when they visited Celtic Park on the 20th of October 1976. It wasn't a major surprise when Celtic inflicted their first defeat of the season, but the margin of victory certainly was, as United were swept aside 5-1, and Glavin was again the driving force, scoring in the first minute with a thunderous 25-yard shot, and adding 2 more in the second half to complete a hat-trick to add to goals from Joe Craig and Bobby Lennox before Paul Sturrock grabbed the consolation goal for United 4 minutes from time. Any hopes a corner had been turned were dashed 3 days later at a stormy, rain-swept Pittodrie, where, despite taking a second-half lead through a Kenny Dalglish penalty, a late Joe Harper double saw another 2 points dropped, leaving Celtic in second place, 3 points behind Dundee United, but level on points with Aberdeen and only 1 point ahead of Rangers, both of whom had a game in hand, as did Leaders United. By Wednesday of that week, another meeting with Aberdeen was arranged in the final of the League Cup, when Celtic's 2-1 win over Hearts on Monday the 25th of October was followed by an astonishing 5-1 win for Aberdeen over Rangers in the second semi-final 2 days later. The match against Hearts was Tom Callaghan's final appearance in a Celtic shirt and was not without controversy. It had been a fairly uneventful first half, Ian Archer writing in the Glasgow Herald of the 26th of October 1976. There was a long overture to the semi-final, half an hour of sterile, exploratory play in which Hearts looked equal. It exploded into life 3 minutes before half-time when Jim Brown shot Hearts into the lead, but 2 minutes later Kenny Dalglish equalised for Celtic from their second corner after conceding, Archer reporting, "Doyle, an improving player, took it on the left and aimed craftily at the near post. Dalglish came away from Gallagher, ducked his head and sent the ball far too fast to give Wilson much chance. So impending boredom was replaced by much interval chatter." Celtic dominated the second half and hit the post twice before the deadlock was broken by a controversial penalty. Hearts claimed for a foul in the build-up, but Celtic was awarded a throw-in on the right, taken by McGrain to Dalglish, who made his way into the penalty box. Hugh Taylor reported in the Daily Record of the 26th of October 1976. Suddenly, centre-half John Gallagher and Celtic skipper Kenny Dalglish tangled near the edge of the penalty area. They continued to push and jostle after the ball was away. Then, dramatically, the referee was pointing to the penalty spot. Dalglish slammed the ball into the net to make the score 2-1. Hearts protested long and bitterly, and 2 minutes later, Rab Prentice fiercely tackled Johnny Doyle. As the Celtic winger lay on the ground, referee Alexander ordered off the crestfallen Prentice. I thought it was a penalty, and a rather silly one, but the ordering off of Prentice seemed to be an unusually harsh decision. The win took Celtic into the League Cup final for the 13th year in succession, although they had lost 5 of the previous 6, so no one considered the upcoming match against Aberdeen to be a foregone conclusion, and they would be without the ineligible Pat Stanton and Joe Craig. A few days before the final match of October, Jock Stein made another surprise move in the transfer market, which seemed a strange one at the time, and a disappointing one for the many admirers of the young Andy Ritchie, who had shown flashes of real genius in his fleeting appearances for the first team, but had never been given an extended run in the side. Stein was looking for cover for the goalkeeping position and paid Morton £10,000 plus Ritchie to bring the 27-year-old Roy Baines to Celtic Park. The pair both played for Morton against Clydebank on the 28th of October 1976, and Baines signed for Celtic after the match. After only 16 first-team appearances, he would rejoin Morton in March 1979, where he would be reunited with the immensely talented Ritchie, who that season won the Scottish Football Writers' Player of the Year award. Baines returned to Morton for £10,000 on the same day Ritchie signed a new 2-year contract. Morton most definitely got the best of that deal. October 1976 ended with the feeling that Celtic had finally turned the corner, with a rebuilt side that was finally beginning to knit together into a formidable unit, and this impression was strengthened by an efficient 2-0 win at Celtic Park over a Motherwell team who had beaten Rangers 3-1 7 days earlier. The first half had been almost incident-free, but after the interval, 2 stunning goals from Kenny Dalglish secured the points. The Sunday Post reported on the 31st of October 1976, "Just call him Dazzler Dalglish, for it took 2 bits of sheer magic by the home skipper to promote a humdrum encounter into the memorable category, at least for the Celtic faithful." Twice in 10 minutes, Dalglish scored with laser-accurate shots from the edge of the penalty area, prompting Alex Cameron to write in the Daily Record of the 1st of November 1976, "Kenny Dalglish put into capital letters the reason he can't be dropped in Scotland's team to play Wales a week on Wednesday. CLASS. He did so playing against a Motherwell team optimistically going for an Old Firm double at Parkhead. The double came all right, in the form of 2 super goals from Dalglish. And so Motherwell, beaten 2-0, have to face the fact that they have little chance of winning the league in spite of their expensive efforts to keep Willie Pettigrew. The opposite is true for Celtic. They have an even chance of winning the League Cup on Saturday in their 13th consecutive final appearance and look likely to improve as the team settles to a steady formation." Angus MacLeod, writing in The Scotsman of the 1st of November 1976, had no doubt what was behind the steady improvement in the Celtic side as the business end of the season approached. For Celtic, this was a good one to win. They are playing with much more assurance and authority these days, most of it stemming from Pat Stanton. His quiet marshalling makes others, especially Roddy McDonald, look twice the players they were last year, gives Danny McGrain the freedom of mind to move forward more often, and generally dispels the unease that saw them slip so badly last term. Celtic, with Stanton, are simply more secure. Up front, Joe Craig is not yet fully settled. He flitted in and out of this game, and his strongest period was when Celtic were already ahead. When he does adjust to the pace of the Celtic attacking, he will be a tremendous asset, since he is both strong and brave. But Celtic have Dalglish, and that is asset enough to be going on with. Jock Stein had returned to work in May 1976 and very quickly set in train the rebuilding of a playing squad that had been decimated by sales, injuries and the retirement of several key players over the previous 3 seasons. By the end of October, they were a point behind Dundee United at the top of the league, but were rapidly improving, and hopes were high that the league championship could be recaptured after 2 successive seasons of disappointment. The future seemed bright again, with the veteran Pat Stanton providing the perfect foil for Roddy McDonald. The world-class talents of Kenny Dalglish and Danny McGrain, supplemented by astute buys like Ronnie Glavin and Johnny Doyle, and the huge potential of emerging stars Roy Aitken, Tommy Burns and George McCluskey. But, just as they seemed to have put the troubled years of the middle part of the decade behind them, winning yet another League and Scottish Cup double at the end of the season, the events of the late summer, early autumn of 1977 would bring the club to its knees as the damned 70s finally came home to roost.